Okay, it's Friday, March 25th after the close, and I was going to do a SPY analysis here just to show what's developing price action-wise on the various time frames and what some of the expectations are. As I go through the charts, I actually have a monthly chart here I'll go by. I have a weekly chart, a daily chart, and then the intraday 15-minute chart. So starting at the weekly chart, what's developing here, you can see that the SPY, after a pretty, big drop after the end of the year into the beginning of this year, we did broaden out lower if you look at this bottom red line. And then in this particular case, on the very last drop down, we try to rally up as it's done a few times before. It came down, it never reached this low target, and then we finally had the 2-up week last week. And that was the time to now have the bias on the short time frame long. And price ended up with a strong green week last week. And then we have a 2 up and then another continuation week this week as we end. We have one more week to go. So right now, obviously, we're biased to the upside until some kind of failure takes place and we head down. It could be a 50%. We could start out up next week and then come to the 50% mark of this middle of this bar. That'll, forecast taking out the lows of this bar. And then we might get a 2 down week and so on. So we're not, that's getting way ahead of ourselves here. But you could also just start out week lower on the week next week and then get a 2 down week. But until we get that, right now we have to say our targets, if I look at the weekly chart here, I know it's hard to see in blue, but when we made this first push up, we targeted these highs, and now that we're continuing higher, we have to say we're targeting these highs right here back in February to take out, at least to broaden higher a little bit on this first push up, and then maybe we'll consolidate and start higher up. In the real bigger picture, if I zoom this out, you can see here, what's really happening is we've broadened lower. If we could eventually take out kind of the middle of this wedge and start higher, then we can clearly be broadening up to 5,000 into all-time highs. Not necessarily a straight line, but that would be where we'd be monitoring, going forward. And the way that's going to happen, just going to the monthly chart, this is what we're really looking to see as we come to one more week to go. Is this month, which is an inside month so far from last month, going to end up green and then follow through to a 2-up month? If that takes that out, the prior month's high, then we are targeting back up to new highs and broadening higher, like I just showed on the weekly chart. If somehow we just fail miserably next week and this becomes a very neutral looking bar, then we have an inside bar here, and it's just a question, do we break out higher or even possibly lower? Anything can happen, but for now, since we have 1 week to go, we're closing kind of green. It looks like we're green, and if next week stays pretty green, that'll show we're closing this month. If we don't, go up strong next week and break these highs, then but we still close green, it'll show like April is really ready to make a new high and then start forecasting up into that area. See, that's what happens. If we can get a monthly high next month, or even at the end of the week, end of this month, then all of a sudden, all these pullbacks on the daily and weekly chart, I'm going to expect to just eventually, resolve back to the upside in line with the new month that's up. So that's very key next week, what happens. Just wanted to point that out. That will mean, again, if we get a big 2-up month, then any pullback on the weekly, I would expect to eventually turn back up again until the monthly chart eventually turns down. And that would take a lot of work to do that. So it's we're getting to a critical week here next week to see how we close the month and how that really, that starts forecasting really what to expect in the months ahead. So we'll see what happens. But so far, I'm biased to the upside. I have been since we broke out, that weekly high back here on the daily chart. That's the blue line where the weekly chart, broke into new highs. So that's why it's been up, up, up since then. And there's really nothing. There's been one red day in here where we got a new low. Today, just to show you what was developing when we were kind of coming to the top of our very short-term, triangle or broadening action to the upside. I generally judge the first 15-minute bar of the day as kind of the early 15-minute price action as to what that day is going to be like. And here's like it started out, near the lows, and we went up for most of the day. So anyway, today we tried to break higher earlier, and then we had a big failure bar. So that to me said, we might be failing on this day for a little pullback. And what I was watching on the daily chart was the midpoint of that part, because when you have a 2-up day trying to break the highs of a previous day that then fails and comes down 50% of the prior day, there's a good chance you're going to be taking out the low of that day. And that could have started a little bit of a pullback. But we kind of stopped there, as you could see. And on the 15-minute chart, that's where it stopped. We were kind of consolidating here, and this was kind of the moment of truth midday. Are we going to break down or continue higher? And as it turns out, the market just stayed steady and closed green, or closed up, on the day. It didn't really break the intraday highs, but it still was a green day. So now we just have, we're just watching next week, the weekly chart. Since it's a green week, I'm expecting a little follow through next week at a minimum. And then we see, do we continue to these targets, or do we possibly fail early on that push up, maybe Monday or Tuesday, and then come immediately down and start a reversal, which means maybe the monthly chart's not going to, it all depends on what happens next week. But for now, definitely the bias is up. I'm still expecting, I could see this thing easily just continuing up and taking out these highs right out of the gate. And at that point, the monthly chart's up, and then all of a sudden, any consolidation we see is just going to, you're going to look at that to head higher eventually. It was a pretty good week overall. After the big push up last week, we definitely had 4 days were buys to the upside, one little pullback day, and then we closed strong. So that's my analysis. I'm going to be, again, monitoring how this next week is going to be the key to a lot of things, but with a bias to the upside. And if we can really take that out in any kind of a strong way, then I think the bigger picture is really looking, much greater, and because it's going to take the monthly chart to turn down at that point once we really get up here. So we'll see what happens. But it was an interesting day that looked like it might fail, but never really took out this, red line, which was the midpoint of the prior day, held that area nicely, and then closed strong. So see what happens early next week with a bias to the upside for now.